In today's video, Booker Prize winner Eleanor Catton explores what happens when a radical guerrilla gardening group receives funding from a billionaire. Women's Prize winner Linda Grant writes about a Latvian Jewish population moving to the UK. A recently divorced woman returns to Palestine and performs in Hamlet. A cold case murder of a black man is investigated by his journalist great-granddaughter. Nilima Rao's mystery novel A Disappearance in Fiji also explores the exploitation of Indian workers in early 20th century Fiji. A multi-generational story about a family of glassblowers, Jennifer Savran Kelly explores conformity, identity and intimacy through gender fluidity and homophobia. After moving from Dublin to Copenhagen, a trans girl is unexpectedly visited by the ex-girlfriend she dated before she transitioned, and we explore infidelity, inequality and William Somerset Maugham. Hello, welcome to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. My name is Scott and I want to start this video off by thanking everybody who has supported this channel. Yesterday I passed 2,000 subscribers and I've grown by over 1,000 subscribers in the last 12 months, and I have really loved the support I've been getting and how this channel has grown and just the general good vibes I'm getting from subscribers, commenters and other people in the booktube community. You lot are really wonderful. Now I'd love to get to 3,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and that number is only moderately unrealistic, so please, if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now. I've told you about the books I've finished reading in the intro, but I haven't told you about the 6 books I've DNF'd yet. And I'm going to start with The Lovers by Yumna Kassab. I think the best way I could describe this novel was if Treacle Walker was a romance. This is a kind of literary fiction novel that you just don't want to be stuck washing the socks of. And if you do, you're certainly not going to be adding any starch. This is poorly constructed pieces of poetry weave together to form a narrative where each page is disconnected from the next. Nothing I read interacted with anything else I read. Granted, I DNF'd this very quickly, but I have no interest in this sort of pretentious BS. Especially when it's a love story. Love stories should be simple. Seeing this book be shortlisted for the Miles Franklin is really disappointing. This is a terrible novel. I don't see how anybody can enjoy this sort of utter crap. The Sun Walks Down, Fiona McFarlane. Another Aussie book I DNF'd, and it's because of the writing style. I have no idea what this book was about, but I couldn't muster the effort to care. Failed to engage me on any level. Skullwater. This is one of the weird and wonderful sounding books that I discovered while I was researching the Booker Prize. A novel about a young man who wants to find the cure for a sick relative, which he believes to be skullwater, the water forming in the skull of a dead person. Straight off the bat, a description like that, you know it's either going to be something amazing or something terrible. It's got that feel of a YouTube video that says, alien life discovered on Mars. You know, either scientists have found some sort of bacteria on Mars and that's going to be super interesting, or it's some conspiracy and just clickbait that wastes your time. I'm really happy to take a risk on these type of books, but they have to impress me early on, and this just didn't. It felt like the Korean version of the Beat Generation with a nostalgic blending of folklore. There is definitely an audience for this book though, it's just not me. Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This was the May read for Amy and Angie's Fiction Addiction Book Club, 2 of my favourite people on BookTube. But this wasn't a Scott book. I think I really like horror when it's the means of communicating something else, when it's the element inside of a book. I really loved Chain Gang All-Stars, and Tenderest of Flesh was one of my favourite reads from a few years back. They're both horror dystopian novels commenting on disinformation and control within the government. Pure horror for horror's sake, it doesn't connect with me, and I kind of found the writing in this to be really basic and a bit boring. The Death of a Heart, Elizabeth Bowen. This book is clearly a step above the 4 other DNFs. The writing is nice, the character work is there. I just got a bit bored and didn't know why I was reading this book. I didn't have something to support, to barrack for, to hope for. I thought the characters were well created, I just didn't care about their outcome. While I trust Elizabeth Bowen was doing something, this just had average written all over it. It was a bit too slow. I just felt like I could have been reading something better. This is a story about an orphan girl who moves in with her wealthy half-brother and is of that age where she's sort of between girl and woman, and she's starting to attract gentlemen suitors. Also, her half-brother doesn't really like her. Definitely a book with potential, and if you're just more tolerant of a slower-paced novel than me, you'll probably get something out of this one. Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. I'm just going to say that I was wrong on this one straight off the bat, and I've put this back on my TBR. I DNF'd this because I didn't like the writing style. It was very, very poetic, and it was just a bit over the top for me. Now, I've since found out that this is broken into 4 parts in 4 different writing styles, and if I had have known that, I would have been much more tolerant of this writing style just to see what the later styles were like, to see if I can persevere and get something out of the other 3 styles. I'll definitely be giving this book another shot. My only real concern is that there is a massive queue for this at the library, and I had already returned it when I realised the error of my ways. Onto the books I've finished, and we're going to go from the book I rate the least to the one I rate the most. Glasswork, Olivia Wolfgang-Smith. This is essentially 4 novellas set 20 to 30 years apart, following the next generation of a family, with 4 different protagonists, and characters from previous generations either become bit part characters or disappear completely. As the story got increasingly modern, they progressively came weaker, and they didn't add much or build upon the earlier stories. What Wolfgang-Smith is exploring is how the choices of the previous generation affect the next, how younger generations don't understand the older generations, and that misunderstanding leads to a troubled relationship. But the examples shown were tenuous and relied too much on miscommunication, or just a real lack of communication in general between the generations. The first story involved an heiress, and she was also a bit of a genius, and she married an abusive man who takes control of her fortune and tries to stop funding this Czech glass blower who is making protective glass for the museum. The glass blower creates a glass bee and gifts it to the heiress. That bee then progressively follows the generations and the storyline. The second story involves her son, and he's falling in love with a woman, and it's slowly revealed to us that the woman is not who the son thinks she is, but that in some way she's actually really good for him. So we have this real conflicted desire. We don't know if we want them to get married and be happy, or if we want him to run away from her. Both of these stories are quite interesting, but they would have been much stronger if they were standalone stories and had a little bit more embellishment and time and side characters and details and, all the things. The third story is about a high-rise window washer who becomes interested and caught up in the life of a gender-bending human who works on Broadway but is running away from something. And the last story is about a stoner who has been made redundant from their bureaucratic job and is trying to break into her office after hours. These 2 stories had potential, but they were much weaker and just lacked in character development. This is true of all the stories, but particularly these last 2, they just felt rushed and like the author didn't want to have an 800-page chunker. And that's what the book required. Either that, or this should have been 4 200 to 300-page novels, all part of a loosely linked series. I really just don't think that this structure worked. I think this book has to go down as a real failure, to be honest. But the next 8 books are all good. Let's start with The Story of the Forest by Linda Grant. Latvia, 1913, and Mina goes into the forest and meets some Bolsheviks. The encounter becomes a story she will tell several generations of her family. Her and her brother try to emigrate to New York, but they end up in Liverpool, where they make a life for themselves within the Scouse Jewish community. This is a real cradle-to-grave story about Mina, about her life and the story of the time in the forest and how that shaped her and her family, but also her identity and the slow, seamless assimilation of an immigrant family into English culture. Not all of Mina's family moved from Latvia to Liverpool. In the section of this novel based in the 1940s, Mina doesn't actually know what happened to her family. This is sort of all that's mentioned about the Holocaust, and it's interesting to see a book that is all about Jewish identity and Jewish people in this time period, not centered on this horrible event. I found Grant's descriptions of pretty standard family dramas really captivating and enjoyable. Her ability to create characters and relationship dynamics is fantastic. Just a writer with a lot of talent at her disposal. But I'm not really sure how much I enjoyed this book. I did enjoy it. Was it pleasant or was it amazing? Grant is writing a fictionalized version of her family's history, and you can tell that she loves and deeply understands most of these characters. But plot-wise, this was lacking a punch. As a family portrait, it's great, but I'm just not sure if this was a really simple book or if something went over my head, because it just feels a little bit light. And the story of the forest, I'm not really sure what it's doing here. I was far more interested in Mina's relationship with her daughter Paula, which I would have liked to have been the focus of the novel. I just feel like the bits I got out of this book were maybe not the bits that Linda Grant expected a reader to get out of the book. But still, this is just an example of a talented writer being good enough to get away with some things that didn't quite work for me. A Disappearance in Fiji, Nilima wrote, I really enjoy this type of novel where it is very clearly a genre fiction novel, but it's giving me something much more at the same time. This is undoubtedly a crime mystery novel. But is the purpose of this book to find out why a woman has disappeared, if she was murdered, and if so, who did it? Or is the purpose of this novel to look at Fijian culture and the history of indentured Indian workers who were basically slaves with a more complex contract? It's delightfully a book that is both of these things. Look, this book didn't blow me away, but I don't have anything bad to say about it either. It was just a really solid, enjoyable read. Good characters, good plot. At times it was quite funny. The themes were well explored, and it taught me something about the history of Fiji. What more can you want? I just can't do anything more than recommend this historical fiction detective novel about slavery. So it was deemed that the white population couldn't take the indigenous Fijian population as slaves and make them work the sugar fields. So instead they went to India and tricked the poor Indian people into coming to Fiji for the promise of a better life. They put them on these super strict contracts where if they didn't complete a full day's work, they didn't get any pay themselves. If they hurt themselves, if they were sick, they didn't get paid, and they were kept in these horrible conditions. The women were preyed upon by men, and they were often too poor to afford to eat food, especially when something went wrong and they got sick. One of these women goes missing, and it's only because a local priest makes a fuss that the police agree to investigate, and we follow an Indian policeman who has been transferred over to Fiji from Hong Kong as a form of punishment. Now, he answers to a white police boss, but he also works with an indigenous Fijian policeman. I loved the banter between the Fijian and the Indian. They did this thing where they mocked the stereotypes with each other. The Fijian would say, "You should come over and see my family," and the Indian would say, "Nah, your family would probably just try to eat me." And the Fijian would reply with, "Don't be silly, you're too skinny. We want somebody with a round bum, not your tiny flat excuse for an ass." Having an Indian policeman was such a clever move for this novel too, because we get to see the attitudes towards him firsthand. He's somebody with a bit more authority, and it adds that little bit of layers to it. It also points out the politics and the corruption within the police force as well, and it creates a much more complex and complete picture of Fijian society. This is a really cool idea for a novel, and I hope that more people follow this style of novel in the future, because I really enjoy it. Time's Undoing by Cheryl A. Head. This is a Black Lives Matter novel, told in two alternating timelines. A modern-day timeline where Megan, a Detroit journalist, is writing a Black Lives Matter story and starts investigating the murder of Robert Lee, her great-grandfather, who was killed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1929. Robert Lee obviously becomes the second storyline. This is a well-executed book that is delivering exactly what it says on the tin. It has a nice storyline and it's something that you can just really get behind. This is a book that's exploring police corruption, the history and the current links between the Klan and the cops, white nationalism, generational embarrassment, the effects of both Obama and Trump on the mindset of white supremacists, the effect of the Klan on the black community, and of course, police murdering black people and the distrust that black people have towards that organization. This book leans slightly to the commercial sides of things. It's very easy to digest. It's very easy to invest in the characters. It's very easy to get wrapped up in the plot, and this makes it a super enjoyable read, but it lacks that emotional smack that would have made it an exceptional read. I loved reading this, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be thinking about this much anymore. A really good, solid book, and I think this is a really good one. If you liked Kindred by Octavia Butler but didn't care for the sci-fi element, you might get a lot out of this book. Endpapers, Jennifer Savran Kelly. 2003 New York. Dawn Levitt works as a bookbinder at the Met. At work, Dawn has to identify as a female, even on days where that isn't true. At home, her partner Lucas is seemingly only attracted to Dawn on days he's at her most masculine. In queer circles, Dawn doesn't fit in either. Are they a butch lesbian? And if they're a butch lesbian, what happens on days they want to wear a pretty dress? And what about their relationship with Lucas? Now, I've been constantly changing the pronoun I use to describe Dawn because I think that best represents their gender. Although, I suppose I could have also been wrong every time I used a pronoun. Dawn is probably something like an AFAB gender fluid pansexual, but no labels are ever put on them. And what's more important is that Dawn doesn't feel like they fit in. Dawn feels like their identity is at odds with the world and that they have to put on various masks and disguises just to get through life. Dawn doesn't see themselves represented in society. There are 3 separate stories going on here, all interacting with each other like any good novel. Dawn discovers a note from the 1950s hidden behind the end papers of an old pulp lesbian novel. There is something in the note and Dawn thinks they recognize an element of themselves, so they begin to see if they can track down the person who wrote it. Dawn's best friend Jay, a straight man, is victim of a hate crime for which Dawn feels responsible. Jay would never have been attacked if he wasn't hanging out with Dawn. Dawn and Lucas's relationship is becoming increasingly unstuck, and Dawn begins to feel that Lucas no longer has any feelings for them. Dawn is looking for their gender identity, for their place in the world, and they desperately seek that out through researching the note found in the end paper. I have never read a novel about somebody with a gender fluid identity, and that was really fascinating. Although, as I've said, I'm not actually sure that Dawn has a gender fluid identity. That's just my interpretation of what they were saying. I definitely think the character drawing of Dawn was the best bit of the novel, and for a book that is about the identity of the main character, that's quite a good thing to say, quite a fortunate thing to think. I just think that this is a really wonderful and thought-provoking read, and I think it's a fantastic book if you were a fan of Tori Peters or Imogen Binney and you just want to explore that queer culture of what is gender and why is it important, but also read a really interesting and entertaining book at the same time. Wild Geese by Soula Emmanuel. Phoebe Ford is an Irish trans woman who has moved to Copenhagen to complete a PhD. She is 3 years into her transition and she unexpectedly reconnects with her ex-girlfriend from before she transitioned, Grace Keeney. Grace is Phoebe's first and only girlfriend. Grace is also bisexual. We follow these 2 queer women around Copenhagen doing normal touristy stuff, but the book is really about these 2 wonderfully drawn characters and the conversations they have and their feelings and emotions and their past and their identity. It is probably really easy to see Phoebe as the trans woman and think that this is a novel about being trans and what it is like to transition, and that's not really what this book is. It's just as much about Grace as it is about Phoebe. This book is a portrait of 2 characters and their relationship not one character. Some of Phoebe's identity and her personality is to do with being trans, but also she's way more than just a woman who has transitioned. She's very intelligent but underpaid. She is scared of intimacy. She doesn't talk with her family much, and she's left them in Ireland to create a new life for herself in another country, in a city where she doesn't know anybody. She's really busted and needs some direction and stability. Grace is in a job she hates. She's constantly thinking about just quitting. Her friends are all getting married and she isn't meeting anybody new. She's recovering from a recent breakup and she is textbook depressed. She doesn't have a lot of hope in her future. She doesn't see how society cares for her. This is also about the relationship between these two characters, and there is a secret that comes to light later in the book that really changes the dynamic between them and makes one of the characters question who they are and who they could have been and which life they would have been happier with. There is also this light level of humour throughout the novel. The girls are discussing beards, and Grace says, "You used to have a beard," and Phoebe replies, "Yes, her name was Grace Keeney." This is a book about divorcing expectations and what the world requires from you and embracing the things that make you happy. It's a sad novel because these two women are sad and they're dealing with depression and a lack of identity and a society that just doesn't give a shit about them. But it's also a novel that is uplifting and with hope. It's a novel about healing in many ways, and it's just a wonderful character and relationship portrait that says a lot about the disaffection people feel towards a society that has turned their back on them. This is a great book if you're a fan of Sally Rooney, but you would like Sally Rooney to be queerer and more complex. Although maybe not quite as well executed as Rooney, it was far more ambitious, and it was just a fantastic read. The House of Doors, Tan Twang Eng. This is a book about two things, inequality and infidelity. But that is an overly simplified description, and the discussion is far deeper and more complex than that. There are two timelines. William Somerset Maugham is visiting a white upper-class family in Malaysia and being told a story by the wife of the couple. The second storyline being the story that the wife is telling about her best friend, a woman who was accused of murdering a man that she claimed was trying to rape her. And just to be clear, an upper-class white woman is under investigation for killing an upper-class white man in 1920s Malaysia. This story also has this understory of the financing of Chinese rebellion, and it taught me about the Chinese brother of Jesus, which is something that I really must read up on because that was truly fascinating and something I knew nothing about. From the outset, it was clear that the wife is disgusted by Morn being a homosexual. In the tale, we see various examples of relationships between white people and Chinese or Malaysian people, and I think this allows for a comparison between the two types of intolerance. But this is merely a starting point for the themes and the ideas that Tan Twang Eng is discussing, and he twists things and makes things much more complex and takes them in a direction that you don't expect them to go, and it's so fascinating. There's a lot of cheating going on in this tale, and it's a really effective way of demonstrating the power balance inside a relationship or a marriage. And this book becomes really feminist, and we realize that the woman who is seemingly disgusted by homosexuals, she is very friendly and talkative to Somerset Maugham. She is a character I completely misjudged early on, and the slow building of the complexity of her character and really all of the characters within this book was an amazing feat of literary skill. The complexity and intersections of justice are weaved together in such a complex and wonderful way. It is so thought-provoking, it's never predictable, and it will generate discussions. I considered this as a potential Booker Prize novel, and I excluded it from my video. But if I had have made that video after I read this book, it would have been one of the 13 books I long-listed. A fantastic layered novel that is magnificently executed, and it seems really harsh on House of Doors to put it third last on this list, but these next two books are just absolutely incredible, and it was so hard to separate them and figure out which one I should talk about last and declare the best. Enter Ghost. Sonia is an Arabic Israeli, or a Palestinian. She lives in London. She is a semi-successful actor. You might recognize her face, but you probably don't know her name. She is newly divorced and she is visiting her sister Haneen in Haifa. While there, she meets Mariam, a director who is wanting to perform Hamlet on the West Bank, and she convinces Sonia to help them and eventually to play Gertrude. What I really adore about this book is that there are two ideas here, and they're both done very successfully. Hammad has written a story about a woman who has recently divorced and is processing that and reconnecting with her family and her roots and figuring out who she is and moving forward with her life. But she's also written a story about protest and defiance, about Palestinian identity within Israel, about Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And these two stories, they don't need each other, but they're really enriched by the presence of the other story. And then, to add another layer to this, there is Hamlet. And this play is being performed in Arabic, and that is seen as an act of protest. There is this one scene towards the end, and it is such an incredible scene. I wouldn't be surprised if this is the scene that came to Hammad first and she built the book around it. Israeli police come to one of the performances of Hamlet and they start watching it, and they have, their guns, and the crowd becomes uneasy, and Miriam continues to perform on stage, and she delivers this speech from Hamlet. She delivers it towards the guards like they're part of the play, and Shakespeare's words take on new meaning. On one hand, it's this powerful scene of, this is who I am. You can accept me or you can kill me. I'm looking fear in the face and I'm not blinking. I'm calling your bluff. Do it. Your silent threats are meaningless. And in another sense, it's about language and culture and understanding, as the police don't speak Arabic, so they don't understand Mariam. And that's symbolic for how Israeli and Palestinian relationships are. Also, it's about how we interpret art, because there was no way Shakespeare is talking about Israel and Palestine when he wrote Hamlet, and yet his words have relevance to it. And what does that even mean, and how does that work, and how do we view art? Does causality exist in art sort of way? The whole book is written with just the most magnificent craft. This is a book where I feel like I only understood 10% of all the references, yet the 10% I got was so rich and so varied. And the level to which you understand this novel, it only adds to the experience, because at the heart of this, the plot is really easy to follow. The characters are just wonderfully drawn and so easy to back, but it's full of these Easter eggs. It just adds so much to this book, and your brain goes off in so many different directions. This is a book that is so rereadable, and it's by an author of just the most sublime talent. I can see this appealing to fans of Camilla Shamsi. It is definitely of that sort of elite quality. Burnham Wood, Eleanor Catton. Burnham Wood is a guerrilla gardening group founded by Mira Bunting, a group of lefties who grow vegetables in suburban locations where it is not strictly legal to do so, and often try and sell the produce. But a lack of money and available land has generally meant that they don't have enough to break good, as they call it. Then a landslide near Thorndike National Park blocks it off and makes it the perfect place for Mira to move Burnham Wood to. But when she investigates, she meets billionaire Robert Lemoyne, who is equal parts prickly and charismatic. Lemoyne made his money in drones and security and has offered to give Mira $100,000 to fund their lifestyle and operation, allowing them to set up something official. Tony is back in the country after living in Mexico for 5 years and wants to make it as a journalist. He was involved with Burnham Wood in the early days and maybe had a bit of a crush on Mira, but when she reveals she's accepted funding from a billionaire, he decides to investigate and use it as a lead. So Owen Darvish and his wife Jill own the land Burnham Wood want to build a farm on, but might have already agreed to sell it to Lemoyne. But It's not a straightforward property sale and something isn't right there. Shelley is Mira's best friend and is an essential cog in Burnham Wood, but she wants to leave and get a normal job and live her life. She wants to leave her idealism behind. These are all the dominoes that Catton has set up, and then she pushes one and sets off this magical chain reaction. Plot-wise, this is an explosive thriller. It is one of those books that you sort of like to dip in and out of and that you're enjoying, and then one day at 11 o'clock you say, oh, I'll just read 10 or 15 pages to help me sleep, and suddenly it's 3:30 in the morning and you have to get up in 3.5 hours, but you only have 30 pages to go and you just have to know how it ends. Catton is exploring trust, capitalism, greed, the disorganization and disunity of the left, the role of journalism, the threat of violence as a means of control. She is having a complex conversation that is ultimately uber critical of everybody creating, endorsing, propping up, simply living within, or trying to dismantle the capitalist system that we live under. It's a super relevant conversation and one that I haven't seen before in literature. Let's make this clear. This book is not a slow reveal that Robert Lemoyne is actually an evil billionaire. There is no such thing as an ethical billionaire. He's a bad guy. That's not a spoiler. But the means in which Lemoyne does what he does is fascinating. Tell me you don't think he's Elon Musk. Catton is a master writer. The characters are well created. Her ability to keep you interested and to create interest while she moves her pieces into the places she wants them is brilliant. I did find some of the characters a little bit too naive or gullible, and this is my only criticism of a book, which I think is just so thought-provoking, so entertaining, made me feel things and think things, and is so unique. I think this is an incredible book that everybody should read. I would be very surprised if you don't see an 8 to 10 minute discussion video on this novel with full spoilers and all the works at some point in the future. There is just way too much to discuss in this novel to do it justice in this short review format. Before I finish this video, I want to thank everybody who voted on my community post. I will be reading Northanger Abbey for Jane Austen July, which is the last Austen novel I need to complete the set. I hope you're all reading something good. Bye bye.